Tonight, what country's Vladimir Putin going to invade next? It's December 17th, and you're watching the Ezra Levant Show. Why should others go to jail when you're the biggest carbon consumer I know?
There's 8,500 customers here, and you won't give them an answer.
You come here once a year with a sign, and you feel morally superior.
The only thing I have to say to the government for why I publish it is because it's my bloody right to do so.
First, Vladimir Putin invaded the country of Georgia. Then he invaded Ukraine. He's tricky about it, though. He creates a fog of war. He claims it's not his troops invading. He says it's locals in those countries, ethnic Russians who want to separate, to be reunited with Russia. Those countries, after all, used to be part of the Soviet Union. Putin says they want independence. They're being picked on, those locals, and if any Russian soldiers did go in, it's to stop Georgia or Ukraine from bullying their ethnic Russians. It's no invasion, he says. He sends in soldiers who aren't wearing Russian uniforms before the West can figure out what happened. It's over. And who's going to stop him? Barack Obama? For Putin, it's as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. So who's next? Here's the former Secretary General of NATO back in February saying to the Telegraph of London, quote, "There is a high probability that he will intervene in the Baltics to test NATO's Article 5. That's the part of the treaty that says every NATO country has to defend against an attack on any NATO country. Do you really think Obama would go to war to protect Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia? Do you think Germany would, or the UK, or France? Back in April, Lithuania's foreign minister revealed that Russia had started massive cyber attacks on his country. And Russian diplomats actually told the West that Vladimir Putin would consider all steps, including nuclear weapons, to keep NATO from deepening its ties to those Baltic countries. Look at this story from Pravda on June 30th. Here it is in an English translation. Prosecutor General's office to check the legality of Baltic exit from the USSR. That's the headline. Here's the money quote. Ready? According to the parliamentarians, the State Council was unconstitutional body, so its recognition of the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania is illegal. As in, Russia is officially reconsidering whether or not these three independent countries should have even been allowed to leave the Soviet Union. Barack Obama visited Estonia a year ago. That deeply angered Putin. So Russia literally kidnapped an Estonian policeman from Estonia, dragged him back to Russia, put him through a sham trial, and this August sentenced him to 15 years in prison. NATO did nothing, of course. The Pentagon's in a panic, by the way. They've started doing war game simulations if Russia invades the Baltics. According to David Ochmanek, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense, the Pentagon has run their simulations 16 times, and every time NATO loses. Obama's new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military officer in America, shocked the U.S. Senate this summer when he said this.
What would you consider the greatest threat to our national security?
My assessment today, Senator, is that Russia presents the greatest threat to our national security. In Russia, we have a nuclear power. We have one that not only has the capability to violate the sovereignty of our allies and to do things that are inconsistent with our national interests, but they're in the process of doing so. So if you want to talk about a nation that could pose an existential threat to the United States, I'd have to point to Russia. And if you look at their behavior, it's nothing short of alarming.
Nothing short of alarming. Don't think it's just the Pentagon. Last year, the Canadian Armed Forces joined NATO Operation Reassurance and deployed 135 Canadians and 4 CF-18 fighters to Lithuania to help stop Russian planes from crossing into Baltic airspace. They intercepted Russian jets, seeing what those jets could get away with. Putin was testing. Look, this is serious stuff. It was national news in Canada. It was international news around the world. Vladimir Putin didn't think the Baltic countries even existed legally. Putin kidnapped an Estonian citizen. Putin cyber-attacked Lithuania. Putin flew jets over Latvia, threatened them all. The Baltics are our allies. Putin wants to devour them next. Putin doesn't even think the Baltics should be a thing. So what does Justin Trudeau have to say? Well, Maclean's magazine asked Trudeau a list of questions the other day, including these.
Second favorite, Justin Timberlake. He's a real JT. Favorite, Baltic nation. That's not a thing.
That's not a thing? The Baltics aren't a thing. He's so stupid, he doesn't know what Baltic countries are. Now, I know that he doesn't mean it in the way Vladimir Putin would mean the Baltics aren't a thing. Trudeau's too stupid. He's not malicious against the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. He truly didn't know they were a thing. He didn't know they were NATO allies in a formal defense treaty with Canada for more than 10 years now. Millions of people live there. He had never heard of them. He thought it was a trick question being played on him by Maclean's with their cheeky pop quiz. He is as stupid as he looks. Now, Vladimir Putin hated Stephen Harper. Harper led the diplomatic charge to put sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion. Harper himself visited the Canadian forces in the Baltics and denounced Putin while standing on a Canadian warship there.
President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, undertaken to serve his own domestic agenda, political agenda, to divert attention from Russia's long-term decline under his rule and to interfere with the democratic aspirations of a sovereign country, these things must not be allowed to stand.
That was Canada until this buffoon got elected.
Favorite, Baltic nation. That's not a thing.
Maclean's magazine that asked Trudeau those questions, they're in total fanboy mode. They thought that answer was great. They called Trudeau the sexiest leader in the world. The rest of us, we call Trudeau the stupidest leader in the world. And Vladimir Putin, he calls Trudeau his new best friend. Stay with us. After the break, we talk to Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace. Welcome back. I tell you, he was the absolute #1 news story for August and September. I'm talking about Senator Mike Duffy, who is in criminal court facing charges involving alleged bribery and corruption. He was the top story then, but the trial continues, and where once there were literally dozens of reporters, so many that they had to set up bleacher-style, risers. Take a look at this video. I think I count a grand total of 4 cameras who remain to follow the trial. Take a look.
Tell you a story. This is going to be a drug step.
What do you mean about the Prime Minister not telling the whole truth?
How many witnesses will we see?
Are you happy to be on the stand?
Are you the only defense witness?
How does it feel testifying in your own trial?
Well, where did they all go? I mean, Mike Duffy hasn't been found guilty or not guilty yet. In fact, it's just getting interesting. The man himself is testifying for the first time. He didn't do so in August and September. Why have the media suddenly lost interest? Not all of them, but most of them. Joining us now from Edmonton is Edmonton Sun senior columnist Lauren Gunter. Hey, Lauren, great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, Ezra.
I think I know the answer. I think you know the answer. But what would the journalists, what would the media party editors say? Why have 90% of the reporters who covered Mike Duffy's trial earlier this fall suddenly don't care anymore?
Well, I think they would probably claim that their readers don't care anymore. But as you alluded to, you and I both know that the reason they're not there anymore is they can't use this trial anymore to beat up on Stephen Harper. So during the early part of the recently concluded federal election campaign, of course they wanted daily coverage of everything that was being said. Now Duffy himself is in the witness stand. The person who's charged with the crime is there testifying on his own behalf, and they have no interest in it at all, none, because it can't be used to embarrass Stephen Harper, who's now out of office.
Yeah, I mean, this should be the most interesting part, and I will say there are some journalists there. I've read some interesting coverage by Christy Blatchford, one of my favorite columnists. I mean, Mike Duffy is a master storyteller. He has a beef with Stephen Harper. He has his side of the tale. That is, by definition, newsworthy if you think this trial is at all. So for all the editors and producers who spent vast resources covering it when it was just in the preliminary stages, there is only one logical answer. The damage to Stephen Harper is done, so Mike Duffy's purpose as a news item is done also. I mean, what does the CBC have to say about this? Go ahead, back over to you, Lauren.
No, let's take another example from the trial itself. I think it was the day 3 of Duffy's testimony. He said, and I know for a fact that the Tory headquarters used misleading robocalls to win at least one seat in BC, and that was Gary Lund's seat on Vancouver Island. And, that should have set off alarm bells all over newsrooms in the country, because, of course, they'd also said that, we know the Tories are very much involved in robocalls and they're manipulating the vote in Canada. The only reason they won the 2011 federal election was because they engaged in widespread voter suppression. And here was someone who claims to know, I don't think he actually did know the inside stuff, but he claimed to have evidence that the Tories had used robocalls, and suddenly all of this interest in preserving democracy from fraud, which was the excuse used for covering robocalls for 2 years by most outlets, suddenly that's all vanished because Stephen Harper's no longer in office and they don't really care about democratic integrity. All they really cared about was getting Stephen Harper out of office.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? And even the coverage of the Senate, I think it was Terry Milewski the other day who said, it's not about Duffy now, it's about reforming the Senate. Oh, really? But even then, Justin Trudeau's announced reforms to the Senate are no reforms at all. They're not constitutional. They're not a Triple E Senate. It's not an abolition of the Senate. It's not a Senate election. He's just having sort of his appointments panel. I mean, it is a non-reform reform, and that's fine with the media party. The same people who were using the Senate as a weapon against Stephen Harper, and by the way, the Senate obviously does need reform. The media party seemed to be manic about that until the evening of October 19th, after which they weren't. In fact, I think some journalists are sort of lobbying for an appointment themselves. It's been a tradition for decades that a journalist gets appointed, whether it's Jim Munson or Mike Duffy or others. I think that with more than a dozen vacancies in the Senate, some media party journalists felt like their conduct during the campaign was an audition for a Senate seat.
Yeah, Craig Oliver, for example, if he isn't already past the age of retirement, certainly did a brilliant audition for liberal flack inside the Senate on election night and all throughout the campaign. You're absolutely right about that. And the other thing is that, here was Harper who said he wanted to try some extra constitutional measures to try and make the Senate more democratic. And there were academics who wrote letters saying, oh my goodness, this is so awful. It's an attack on a Canadian institution. And now Justin Trudeau says he wants to have a secretive appointments recommendation panel operating in behind a curtain, and somehow that doesn't bother anybody.
Yeah, there's no public interest lawyers running to the Supreme Court to appeal it or challenge it. Like you say, there's no academics weighing in on it. And remember that Stephen Harper himself, the reason he got into this pickle was that for the first 2 years he was prime minister, 3 years, he didn't appoint anyone to the Senate. I mean, a couple of appointments. I think he made 2. But then he just sort of let it lie open. That was his sort of default Senate reform. It was only in 2008 when the Liberal NDP Bloc Québécois coalition looked like they might have a constitutional moment and take power after the 2008 election. Harper hastily made a bunch of appointments, but even then he let it lay fallow. Where are the voices in the media party now saying Justin Trudeau should not pack the Senate, which he's basically telegraphed that he's going to do?
Well, there are 22 vacancies at the moment. And as that number rose over the last year to 18 months, there were lots of media commentators who would go and they would find a constitutional law expert at, some small college somewhere in the Niagara Peninsula or whatever, and have that person say, this is an outrage, this is an attempt to reform the Senate by stealth, it's unconstitutional. And then, of course, now they're saying, well, it was just awful, he didn't appoint more senators. So they would claim that the institution was undemocratic. So Harper tried to make it a little more democratic. And then they would go and they would find experts who would say that that was unconstitutional because it was too democratic. I mean, they tried to have it both ways so long as they could use it as a cudgel to hit Stephen Harper over the head.
Yeah. We should make a list of all the things that the left and their echo chamber in the media thought were just so terrible about Stephen Harper. His spending on advertising and polls, his work on Senate, whether or not he reformed it, his muzzling of civil servants, all the things that the left claimed to despise about Stephen Harper. Let's keep an eye on those issues in the next 4 years as Justin Trudeau inevitably uses the levers of power for himself. Suddenly all the things that were great moral challenges for Stephen Harper, signs that he was a dictator or a micromanager, they're going to be signs of Justin Trudeau's strong leadership. That's my prediction. Last word to you, Lauren Gunter.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think you're right. And when you talk about control freaks in the PMO, I mean, Jean Chrétien was as much a control freak as Stephen Harper, but because he was doing the work of the angels, the media never bothered the media party that he was doing that.
Lauren Gunter, senior columnist, Edmonton Sun, thanks so much for joining us today via Skype from Edmonton. Stay with us, folks. More after the break.
Looking for the perfect gift? Did you know the Rebel.media has a store? Make a statement with a t-shirt. Have your morning coffee in a Fearless Travel coffee mug. There's even an Ezra Levant bobblehead. It's a one-stop shop for the perfect gift. And don't forget to pick up something for yourself. Go to therebel.media/store to find out more.
Welcome to the program. One of my favorite guests over the years, not just here at the Rebel.media, but at the Sun News Network, is my friend Patrick Moore. He was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, but over the years he's been skeptical of some of their ideology and their politics. He's stayed true to his original mission of loving ecology and a clean environment. He's parted ways with the crazier politics. He joins us now via Skype from Mexico. Hey, welcome to the program, Patrick. And by the way, I should mention you're also the chair for energy and ecology of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. So you're wearing a few hats. Nice to see you again.
Good to be back. It's been too long, Ezra.
Well, it's nice to see you. You're in Mexico now, but a couple of days ago, you were in Paris at the, 40,000 person jamboree. Truly a movable feast. It goes from Paris, next year Marrakesh, all the five-star tourist destinations. You were there as one of maybe, do you think there were even 100 skeptics at the entire conference of 40,000 people?
Actually, none of us were at the conference, except for a couple. I think CFAC went there and had a booth, but that place sucks your soul dry, Ezra. I don't want to go near it. So we had our own conferences, two of them, in fact, one with a group of Europeans and Brits, which was really an interesting group because these are people who, most of them believe that the sun is responsible for the Earth's climate and that changes in the sun and the planets, the gravitational forces, etc., are involved in these 100-year cycles or 200-year cycles that we've been going through for the last couple thousand years. And so that's very interesting, and I learned a lot there. And I gave them my presentation on ocean acidification being such a fabrication. And then we had another conference with Americans and Canadians, which was more of what you'd think of as being the skeptical position that carbon dioxide is not responsible for warming of our climate, and that in fact it is very beneficial for the growth of our crops and trees and all the plants on Earth, which is the food for everything that lives here. Yes. So we had a really, really excellent opportunity. I met a lot of people who were just email addresses to me before that.
Well, that sounds great. I did a video commentary on what I call sort of the new speak or the duck speak of the conference, and you see people who are in this hothouse for a week or so with thousands of other people, and they start using these terms like a jargon, but it becomes like a mantra, and it becomes, I don't want to say cult-like, because that sounds too insulting, but it's this world of unreality that you know, the idea that you can control the world's temperature by 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees as if it's a thermostat, and then that can be controlled by hammering out a legal political document. Like, either you're in, or either you buy into that entire fantasy world, or you can't have one toe in that swimming pool. You know what I mean? You can't be half pregnant. Either you buy into the whole mythology, legend, myth of it, or you're a skeptic. There's no moderates in that conference, are there?
Well, actually, you're talking about the actual cult, which is a central group of people who are driving this thing. But of course, China is not in the cult. And neither is India, and neither is Japan, and neither is Russia. As a matter of fact, most of the countries that are there are just playing along. And, you know, long before this conference, President Obama and the head of China met and agreed, Obama agreed that China could continue to increase its CO2 emissions until 2030. Like, that's the end of time. And so China is happy to vote in favor of this thing because there's no restrictions on them whatsoever. It's totally voluntary. And as a matter of fact, they've made it clear that they're continuing to not only build new coal-fired plants in China, but build coal-fired plants for about 25 other countries in Africa and Asia. Yeah. So they're going full steam ahead. Meanwhile, we are, for some reason, strangling ourselves with a giant belt here in order to look, I don't know, good, you know, and the demonization of fossil fuels is just completely gone overboard now. And I even see the Greenpeace and the Council of Canadians are saying that the Energy East pipeline will never be built because it's against the principles of this climate accord, when in fact its purpose is to replace offshore foreign oil. It's not meant to add new oil to Canada's consumption. It's just meant to replace offshore oil, which would certainly reduce supertanker accident potential. All that oil is being delivered to the Atlantic seaboard with supertankers. And I'm sure there's a fair amount of carbon emissions from those supertankers as they bring that oil to us. So they're just completely out of whack.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've read the treaty, or at least the 32-page introduction and the formal text. The only binding thing is that they've all agreed to get together again for another super party, the next one in Morocco. There's no binding targets, no binding actions. They say every country can do whatever it wants. I mean, even James Hansen, the chief climate alarmist at NASA for years, called it a fraud, and he actually swore, which was quite something to see. But let me pull back to a couple things, because I remember when you and I went on the Sun News Network Freedom Cruise for a week, and I certainly enjoyed spending a week with you there, and I learned a few very basic things from you, because you're an ecologist first and an advocate second, and just some simple truths that these cult members ignore, like human life and animal life and all life does better in warm places than cold places. That's why there's more species, more cities, more people near the equator than at the poles. You mentioned the obvious point that for most of the planet's existence, there was a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere, and that led to a lot more vegetation. You mentioned the obvious point that we're still in a mini ice age. We have ice on both poles. These are just simple truths that if you told people, they say, oh yeah, that's right. But the cult doesn't even get into facts like that.
Well, yeah, they look back about 100 years when in fact there's 4.6 billion of them to consider, and how the climate has changed, especially over the last 500 million years since modern life emerged in the Cambrian explosion of life. So you have to take into account how temperature and carbon dioxide have varied over those many millennia. And it's very clear, looking at what we understand about the various levels they were at, was not only CO2 much higher through most of the history of life, temperature was much higher globally through the whole history of life, and life flourished during those periods. There's less area vegetated on the Earth now than there was during the warmer periods when the poles were free of ice and were covered in forests. And as recently as 3.5 million years ago, when you look in long term, 3.5 million years is recent. As recently as that, there were giant camels roaming in subtropical forests on Canada's Arctic islands before they froze over in this Pleistocene ice age that we are still in now.
That's incredible. If there was one fact that you wanted to tell severely normal Canadians about the theory of man-made global warming or about the Paris Climate Conference, if there was just one simple truth or simple fact that maybe would be a eureka moment or something for people to consider, what would that be?
All the carbon dioxide that we are putting in the air from burning fossil fuels came from the air in the first place because plants used it as food. And that's why there's so little CO2 in the air now, and especially until we came along and started replacing some of it. We are actually bringing a balance back to the carbon cycle on planet Earth because it was going down, down, down for 150 million years. Look it up on the internet. Google 500 million year graph of carbon dioxide levels on planet Earth, and there it is for you to see. And we came along, and at what was 34 seconds to midnight, with analogy with the atomic clock, we started putting some carbon dioxide back in the air to sustain plant life on this planet. Because without CO2 in the atmosphere, this would be a dead planet. So please, everybody, turn it on its head. CO2 is not dangerous. It is not a pollutant. It is not going to cause a catastrophe. It is the most important food for all life on Earth and always has been and always will be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one point I like to mention is, you have this propaganda group called 350.org, as in 350 parts per million of CO2. And I think the world is just over 400 now. But what we exhale, our human breath out, is what? 40,000 parts per million CO2. So it's obviously not poison or pollution. It's the stuff of life. It's the stuff of our exhalations and what plants use for photosynthesis. It's incredible to me that a literal element in the periodic table of the elements, carbon, could be demonized as something unnatural. I mean, the only thing more absurd would be to say oxygen is. Last word to you, Doctor.
Yeah, well, you've got it right there. See, the CO2 that we're breathing out is the same CO2 that the plants we ate and the animals we ate that ate the plants. That's the same CO2 that the plants took in. That's why our CO2 is not actually an addition to the global CO2 levels in the environment, because it's all in an annual cycle with our crops. But the CO2 from the fossil fuels we burn is a net addition to the carbon cycle, and it's a very positive one, and we've got to stop thinking of it as being negative, or we will drive ourselves into ruin.
Isn't that great to hear you speak so plainly? Well, I tell you, it's a pleasure to talk with you again. Hey, maybe if we have another cruise, we can invite you along. I'd love for some of our viewers to have the opportunity to spend time listening to your science and your love for ecology to prove that this fear-mongering is not the way. Patrick, great to see you again.
Well,
thanks for joining
Ezra, I forgot to mention that I have actually learned the secret to changing the climate in all of my studies.
Oh, what's that?
Basically, you just fly from Canada to Mexico in the winter.
Yeah, and you've changed the climate for yourself. Look at you there in your summer shirt. You're making me jealous, although it's sort of nice here in Toronto. You've changed the climate, haven't you?
Yes, and just one more fact. Coming down the Eiffel Tower from the top to the bottom, the temperature changes by 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is more than these goofy people think we should be allowed to increase the Earth's climate. It just coming and moving from San Francisco to Berkeley, just across the bay, changes your annual temperature by 2 degrees Celsius, more than their target. So it's that's how stupid it is that they're setting these numbers that have no bearing whatsoever. The temperature changes by 15, 20 degrees every day, many days, and they're worried about 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Incredible. Dr. Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace and the Ecology and Energy Chair at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Stay with us, folks. More after these words.
Ontario residents are being hosed on electricity prices. The latest Auditor General's report says we've been overcharged by $37 billion over the last several years. That works out to nearly $2,800 for every man, woman, and child. Why? Mismanagement and bad policy choices from the Ontario Liberals. It's going to cost us billions more in coming years. Energy Minister Bob Chiarelli won't take responsibility. He's lashing out. It's time for Bob to go. If you agree, go to firebob.ca. That's firebob.ca and make your voice heard.
Welcome back. My favorite part of the show, your viewer feedback. Merrick writes, the truth is socialism's biggest enemy. When it has gotten to the point that the lefties are trying to block what you have to say, it means you're doing a bang-up job. Side note, I remember when family would travel back to Poland during the communist 70s, you were not permitted to return with a family photo that included your family sitting at a dinner table with food. It would be taken at the border. You see, at the time, the news in communist countries was claiming that there were food shortages in the West. A simple picture would break that myth, so border guards would actually take the time to look at any photos that you may be traveling with. Isn't that incredible? I think that today's censors aren't so blunt as that. They're not so obvious. They censor you, they block you. I want to look deeper into the censorship of the internet by internet companies, by Google and Facebook and Twitter. These companies, they're private companies on the face of it, but they dominate like oligopolies, huge swaths of the internet. And in the name of terms of service or political correctness, they're starting to block and ban ideas that people find offensive. Well, everything's offensive to someone. We'll talk more about that in the days ahead. Nate writes, I love your show and have introduced many friends to the Rebel. However, I am also a member of a public sector union and can't help but notice your habit of painting us all with the same brush. It hurts every time. Well, thank you for writing, and thank you for saying that. And of course, what you say is true. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, I suppose, people who work for the public sector in some way. One of our strongest supporters drives a bus in Alberta. Doesn't mean they're a bad person, doesn't mean they're not a conservative who's fighting the good fight with us. So you're right, when I say public sector unions or government unions, I am painting with a broad brush. I suppose I should be more precise in my language and say things like union leaders or union bosses. And I think that's fair, and that's not an overly broad brush, because those union bosses take union dues from all their union members, left wing, right wing, big government, small government, those who are worried about the Islamization of Canada and those who love it. Take all those union dues and use it for a certain political point of view, a very left-wing point of view. So you're right. I appreciate the ironic tone of your letter. I should say union bosses, and where appropriate, I should name those actual unions, PSAC, QP, for example. All right, Renee writes, you are a good guy doing great things for Canada, Ezra. I am still a huge fan, but please be careful not to pigeonhole people. I am sorry you ran into some self-righteous vegetarians. That must have been very frustrating. As with all groups of people, vegetarians are as diverse as any group of people. Please don't say things about me that you don't know are true. I think you failed on this one, but I am still a huge fan. Well, hey, and that's in the same vein as the letter before it, which is, it's true. Listen, I actually don't have a beef with vegetarians. I make a lot of jokes about it because, as you can see, I like to eat everything and not just veggie. And I believe that we are biologically built to eat meat. Just look at our teeth. We have canines. We are built to eat meat. I actually don't have a big beef with vegetarians, other than most vegetarians I find just got to tell you about their vegetarianism. It's the coolest thing they got going on. I don't want to hear about it anymore. I'm going to do a show later this year about this, about the difference between vegetarian activists, vegans, even animal rights activists, and anti-oil activists, which is this. Someone who's telling you how vegetarian they are, how vegan they are, they're usually not saying that while they're chomping on a big drumstick. But I have never yet seen an anti-oil protester who didn't use oil and gas. So again, I take your point. Sometimes I poke fun at vegetarians just because it seems like a fun thing to do. But I acknowledge that there are some noble vegetarians and even some conservatives. Maybe you're one of them. Well, everybody, thanks for watching the show today. I hope you enjoyed it. And please come back tomorrow. We got more ahead. In the meantime, send me your thoughts. And as you can see, listen, I don't mind reading letters of criticism. We could all use some constructive criticism. And I even like to read the destructive criticism too, as you know. Send me an email to ezra@therebel.media. Facebook me. I love our Facebook page. I don't know if you've been to it yet, but you just got to go. Or tweet me on Twitter, whatever you like. In the meantime, I'm Ezra Levant, saying keep fighting for freedom.